8 million people watched as Karoline Leavitt humiliated Jasmine Crockett in under a minute. One smirk, one cutting line, one perfectly timed insult on live television. The cameras caught it. The audience laughed. Twitter erupted. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't clap back. She didn't even blink. Because when you've been underestimated your whole life, silence isn't surrender. It's a strategy. And that night, while pundits spun headlines and Karoline tweeted a victory lap, Jasmine Crockett opened her laptop and changed the story. Not with a mic, not with a slogan, but with a document, a proposal, a plan, built not for applause, but for action. And in the hours that followed, the real power in that room wasn't the woman who talked over her. It was the one who never raised her voice because she was too busy raising the bar. This is a dramatized retelling inspired by real themes of injustice, politics, and quiet courage. While the story is fictional, the emotions and the questions it asks are deeply real. The air inside Studio 4 was cold, but it wasn't the kind of cold you'd feel on your skin. It was the kind that settled in your chest and made your breath feel too loud. A haze of artificial fog drifted across the glossy studio floor, catching the LED lights just right. Everything gleamed like theater. The debate hadn't even started, but the performance had. Behind the camera wall, producers whispered into headsets, cue cards shuffled, and someone adjusted the tint on the studio backdrop to make it less congressional, more emotional. The moderator's smile had been rehearsed. The jokes were pre-cleared. Even the applause had a light to cue it. Jasmine Crockett stood just outside the frame, hands clasped gently in front of her. Her blazer was sharp but simple, her earrings understated, and in her right hand, a folder. Well-worn, dog-eared, marked with color tabs that hinted at preparation most would never ask about. Her aide, Liana, leaned in one last time and whispered, "Don't take the bait tonight. You know what they want." Jasmine nodded, eyes fixed on the set. "Let them want," she murmured. "We brought something better." She stepped forward as her name was called. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, camera ready and commanding. Her mic had been adjusted twice, her hair checked 3 times. She wore the confident smile of someone who knew the crowd was already on her side, or at least trained to laugh when she landed the right punchline. She'd come prepared with zingers, quotes, and a viral-ready smirk. This wasn't about policy, this was about moments, and Jasmine knew it. As she sat down, a stagehand slid her microphone under the collar of her jacket. The makeup artist gave her one last dusting of powder and whispered, "They're saying she's going to come for your housing numbers." Jasmine didn't flinch. Then she'd better have her own. The lights overhead shifted to warm tones. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, and then silence. The first question was polite enough, the kind of question meant to warm the air between two women destined to clash. But it took just 6 minutes for Karoline to pivot. "You don't actually believe that's a real solution, do you?" she asked, with just enough sarcasm to slice through the studio. Her voice had a rhythm, rehearsed but effective. "Because if that's the best you've got, Congresswoman, I'm not sure what exactly you're bringing to Washington." There was a brief, imperceptible pause in the room. Cameras zoomed in. Producers leaned forward. This was the moment they'd hoped for. The bait was dangling. The crowd held its breath, but Jasmine didn't take it. She blinked. Once, then smiled, softly, genuinely. The kind of smile you only wear when you know something no one else in the room has figured out yet. Her response was quiet. "I bring receipts," she said, and then just as calmly, "But go on." It was subtle, so subtle the crowd almost missed it, but the control room didn't. "Clip that," a producer said. "That's going viral." What the audience didn't see, what no camera could have captured, was the weight of what Jasmine carried into that room. Not just her folder of facts, but the voices behind it. People who had told her their stories, not in front of cameras, but in church basements, food banks, community centers, veterans, single moms, seniors choosing between insulin and rent. And tonight, none of them were in the studio. But Jasmine carried them anyway. This wasn't just another panel. And she wasn't just another politician. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to wait. Because sometimes the most devastating answers don't come from louder voices. They come from the one who never raised hers. Karoline leaned in, just slightly, but enough to let the cameras catch the glint in her eye. Her voice lilted with playful disdain, the kind that disguises a strike beneath a smile. Because if your solutions rely on statistics and slogans, I'm not sure we're even having a serious conversation. A few audience members chuckled, soft, uncomfortable, but real. Liana backstage shifted in her seat. She could feel it in her spine. Karoline wasn't debating policy. She was performing dominance. And by the way, Karoline added, turning just slightly toward the moderator, as if to appeal to her humanity, if we keep pretending these issues are solved with hope and hashtags, we're going to lose the people who work hard and follow the rules. The camera cut to Jasmine. She didn't move. Not an inch. Not a flinch. That's when the tension shifted, quietly like a breeze in a closed room. The moderator, clearly uncomfortable, tried to interject, but Karoline waved her off with a half smile. Just one more thing, she said, voice honeyed but sharp. Congresswoman Crockett is clearly passionate, but sometimes passion needs a little math behind it. You can't budget on feelings. There it was, the line. The one rehearsed in front of staffers and mirror rehearsals. The one that would play well in clips, sliced and served to cable news panels. The one meant to humiliate. And for most people, it might have worked. But Jasmine had learned something long ago. Back when the world still thought silence was weakness. She'd learned it sitting in courtrooms where her presence alone was doubted. She'd learned it as a black woman in spaces where intellect was weaponized against people who didn't talk like the brochure. She had learned that the most powerful tool in a room wasn't volume, it was timing, so she stayed still. Then she leaned back, folded her hands gently across her lap, and looked at Karoline not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with something even more dangerous. Clarity. You done? She asked softly, tilting her head just enough to remind everyone that this wasn't her first insult, just the most public one. Or are you still workshopping your punchlines? The room paused. Even the moderator blinked. The crowd, unsure whether to laugh or listen, fell into a respectful, charged silence. Jasmine leaned forward, voice even. You call it slogans. I call it survival. You talk about math. I talk about months. I talk about the months it takes for people to get a housing voucher approved. The months veterans wait to be heard. The months single parents live out of their cars while someone in D.C. checks boxes on a screen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. People aren't struggling because of slogans, she added. They're struggling because of systems, and you don't fix systems by dismissing the people inside them. Karoline tried to respond, but for the first time she stumbled. Her prepared lines, so sharp just moments ago, now felt brittle. Well, I think what I'm saying is, but the moment had already turned. Jasmine hadn't just blocked the attack. She had absorbed it and re-aimed the entire room. The control room erupted. That's the clip. That's it, someone whispered into a headset. Mark that. Cut that. Backstage, Liana exhaled. She'd seen Jasmine hold a courtroom with nothing but posture. She'd seen her walk into a room of doubters and leave it full of believers. But tonight was something else. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett wasn't defending herself. She was exposing the game. The studio lights faded slowly, but the energy in the room lingered like static after a thunderstorm. The moderator offered a quick handshake. Karoline beamed as if she just won a medal, and producers began ushering everyone off stage before the next segment rolled in. Jasmine stood calm as ever, removing her mic with a gentle flick of her fingers. No one clapped. No one needed to. The performance was over, but the real work hadn't even started. Back in the dressing room, the silence felt heavier than anything Karoline had thrown at her. Jasmine walked in, slid the folder from her arm to the small coffee table, and sat, not in the chair, but on its armrest, one heel still on, the other already kicked to the floor. Liana entered a second later, arms crossed, eyes scanning Jasmine's face for some sign of emotion. She really thinks she got you, she said. Jasmine didn't even look up. She did what she came to do, she replied. Then after a beat, but that doesn't mean I didn't. Outside the door, a producer's laughter rang faintly through the hallway, followed by the soft hum of a vending machine. Jasmine finally met Leanna's gaze. "We're not playing the same game," she said, her voice low but firm. She reached for her laptop, flipped it open, and waited as the screen lit her face. No tweets, no rebuttals, just the draft, already at version 9.3, of the proposal she'd been working on for months. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't designed for headlines, but it had weight. It had math. It had stories. And it had names. Alonzo, a Marine with 3 kids, evicted while waiting on backlog VA paperwork. Julia, a full-time nurse sharing one room with her mother and 2 daughters because their housing voucher sat stalled in an outdated state system. Jasmine didn't need a debate to remember them. She carried their stories like currency, real receipts, not rhetorical ones. Karoline had walked off stage into the arms of her comms team, preparing sound bites and victory tweets. Jasmine sat alone with a blinking cursor and policy gaps no one else seemed interested in closing. The difference wasn't just style, it was substance. And in that quiet, untelevised moment, something settled inside her. Not anger, not resentment, but resolve. She highlighted a paragraph, adjusted the language in a subsection, deleted a line about funding delays, and rewrote it with greater precision. Liana sat across from her, watching. "You don't want to wait until tomorrow?" she asked. Jasmine shook her head. "They think the moment already passed," she said, "but we're just getting started." No headlines, no hashtags, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the steady tap of a woman rewriting the rules, while no one was watching. Outside the studio, the headlines were already being written. Clips of Karoline's smirks and sound bites zipped through social media faster than fact-checkers could catch their breath. Conservative influencers dubbed it a masterclass in control, praising her for cutting through liberal noise. Memes surfaced within minutes. Karoline raising an eyebrow. Jasmine mid-blink. Text overlays mocking silence as defeat. Comment sections lit up like brush fires. This is what happens when you come unprepared. She didn't even fight back. Classic. Another soft-spoken, phony exposed. And under it all, likes stacked up by the thousands. To the public eye, the show was over. The winner had walked off with the last word. But that version of the story, as most viral things are, was a mirror. Carefully angled, strategically lit, and painfully incomplete. Back at the hotel, Jasmine sat at the edge of her bed with the remote in hand, the TV casting a dull glow across the room. A rerun of the segment played again, now framed by a panel of analysts discussing optics, dominance, and viewer perception. They spoke in jargon, dissecting her facial expressions like tactical failures. One analyst even said, "If Crockett had a point, she should have made it louder." Jasmine muted the volume. That wasn't analysis. That was appetite. And they weren't feeding on ideas. They were feeding on performance. And yet, she couldn't entirely blame them. In a world trained to cheer for the loudest voice, silence rarely registers as strength. Liana returned from a coffee run, eyes narrowed as she noticed the muted screen. They're still running it like she scored a knockout. Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't have to. The plan had never been to win the room. It was to change the conversation. "You sure you don't want to push back?" Liana asked, handing her the coffee. "You've got quotes. We could line up an exclusive. Flip the spin." Jasmine shook her head, gently setting the cup on the nightstand. "Not yet. Let them talk." She pulled her laptop from the nightstand drawer, opened the document again. Every time she looked at it, it felt heavier. Not because of the file size, but because of what it carried. Real data, real stories, real policy. It had been built in pieces, anecdote by anecdote, statistic by statistic, through town halls, listening sessions, church visits, and whispered stories from people who didn't believe anyone in Washington actually listened. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a reckoning, one they hadn't seen coming because they were too busy watching for zingers. And that was the part no one was cheering for, because no one had seen it yet. The truth was, Karoline's team had tweeted out their highlight reel before they even reached the green room. But Jasmine hadn't said a word. Her silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, not with pride, not with pain, but with patience. Because while pundits replayed a moment, Jasmine was preparing to release a movement, and when it came, it wouldn't scream. It would land like a stone dropped in still water, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Back on screen, Karoline smiled wide as the moderator thanked her for such clarity. Jasmine blinked once, then closed the laptop slowly. "They're cheering for a moment," she said under her breath, "but they won't know what hit them when the moment ends." The cursor blinked steadily on her screen, illuminating Jasmine's face in the dim light of the hotel room. The hum of the city outside was a soft background drum beat, barely audible over the silence in her mind. The document was open, page after page of lines that didn't just represent data, they represented people. She scrolled slowly, not because she didn't know what was there, but because she remembered every name behind each sentence. This wasn't a bill built in a vacuum. It was stitched together from living stories, collected one by one in rooms that had no microphones and in towns that never made headlines. There was the church basement in Tallulah, Louisiana, where a grandmother had pressed a folded eviction notice into her palm after a listening session, her voice trembling as she said, "This ain't just paper, it's my grandchildren's future." There was the makeshift shelter in Detroit, where a former delivery driver, now living out of his car, had quietly handed Jasmine a spiral notebook full of dates, rejections, and waitlist numbers, a journal of bureaucracy that had failed him over and over. And there was the community health fair in El Paso, where a woman whispered through tears, "I worked 2 jobs and still had to pick between rent and my daughter's insulin. I just, I thought someone in Washington should know." Jasmine hadn't forgotten a single one. Not their faces, not their words, not the silence they left behind after they spoke. Hopeful, maybe, but heavy with doubt. Because they'd told their stories before, and nothing had changed. So Jasmine carried them, not just emotionally, but literally. Notes in the margins of a binder that traveled with her, names protected but stories preserved. She had entered data into spreadsheets on airplanes, cross-referenced voucher delays while waiting in back hallways before hearings, and typed policy drafts in cafes between connecting flights. There were no photos of these moments, no tweets, no headlines. But they existed, and they mattered. She highlighted a paragraph in the current draft that mentioned a proposed fund reallocation from underused emergency programs to streamline voucher processing. Then she paused. She remembered Alan, the former Army medic in Indianapolis who waited 7 months for his housing papers to be approved. He'd said something that stuck with her. "It ain't the system that breaks you. It's how long it leaves you waiting without a voice." She rewrote the paragraph. More specific, more urgent. Outside the window, the night deepened. Liana had already turned in, sensing that Jasmine wouldn't sleep anyway. And she was right. This kind of work wasn't something you clocked in and out of. It clung to you. It shaped you. It demanded you be the one who showed up even when no one else was looking. Jasmine leaned back, her eyes scanning a section labeled, "Delays in State Disbursement in Digital Access." She had to make it stronger. Not fancier, not flashier, just harder to ignore. Because when this was released, it wouldn't be her name that needed defending. It would be the people no one else had written into policy. The ones who only existed in side comments and footnotes until now. She saved the document and stared at the title at the top. The work they refused to do. Not a slogan, not a threat, just a truth. And she would carry it until they couldn't ignore it anymore. At 5:02 a.m., the hotel room was still cloaked in soft blue-gray darkness. The city of Providence hadn't yet stirred. Outside the window, street lamps glowed over quiet sidewalks and shuttered coffee shops, while newspapers landed on doorsteps with the same rhythm they had for decades. Inside, Jasmine sat at the desk in silence, her laptop open, the document glowing like a small fire. She had been up all night, not out of nerves, but purpose. Her fingers moved slowly now, not editing anymore, but reviewing every line one final time, checking dates, citations, funding sources, and testimonial accuracy. There were no dramatic music cues, no camera crews preparing for a reveal, just the soft ticking of a travel clock on the nightstand and the rhythmic tapping of keys. She knew she could have waited for a meeting, a scheduled announcement, a news cycle to spin in her favor. But waiting was exactly what the people behind the bill had already done too much of. They'd waited on case managers, on paperwork, on the system to process them. They'd waited until their lives cracked under the pressure of delay. Jasmine wasn't going to wait anymore. She clicked save, closed her eyes for just a second, then opened her email. The subject line had been ready for days. Subject: the work they refused to do. No introduction, no flourish, just an attachment and a 3-sentence message to her legislative director in D.C. Attached is the finalized draft. Verified citations, budget breakdown included, ready for distribution. At 5:11 a.m., the email was sent. By 6 a.m., her communications team received a scheduled press release draft, written without a single flourish of outrage. It simply announced the release of the housing reform proposal and included a PDF attachment titled, "The Work They Refused to Do." No press conference, no podium, no fiery opening remarks. Jasmine didn't need to perform. She just needed the truth to land in the right inboxes. At 6:22 a.m., her phone buzzed once. Liana. "It's done," the message read. Jasmine responded with one word: sent. And with that, something shifted, not in the headlines, not in the hashtags, but in the current beneath them. A document, years in the making, grounded in real voices, had been released not with noise, but with weight. While Karoline's team was still asleep, replaying their win, Jasmine had already changed the conversation. No spectacle, no mic drop, just the first quiet step of a fault line beginning to split. And as the sun began to rise over the East Coast, it would not be brightness that woke Washington. It would be what had arrived in their inboxes without warning, without headlines, and without mercy. At exactly 7:42 a.m., Megan Lynn, a junior political correspondent at the Philadelphia Inquirer, sat at her cluttered desk, nursing her first coffee of the morning, scrolling through an inbox buried under press releases, event invites, and campaign spam. She was halfway through deleting yet another boilerplate subject line when one email made her pause. It was the simplicity of it that caught her eye. No bold claims, no dramatic urgency, just the work they refused to do. She clicked. The PDF was clean, subtle branding, no color, no pictures. But when she opened the first page, something shifted in her breath. It wasn't what the document said, it was how it said it. Case studies, real names, funding trail breakdowns, graphs that didn't just show where the money was going, but where it hadn't. Testimonies from nurses, veterans, displaced mothers, all neatly cited, threaded into policy recommendations that were both radical and rational. It didn't read like a politician's pitch. It read like a reckoning. She didn't close the file. She forwarded it, first to her editor, then to a colleague at NPR. The subject line stayed the same. By 7:54 a.m., that same file had reached the inbox of Devin Sharp, an assistant editor at the Dallas Morning News. He'd covered Jasmine before, once during a town hall in Fort Worth, where she spent more time listening than talking. He remembered her not for what she said, but for the way she remembered everyone's name on the follow-up visit 3 months later. He opened the document expecting fluff and found pages laced with legislative muscle. By 8:09, he was reading it aloud to his managing editor. Meanwhile, at Face the Nation, a research assistant named Theo Gutierrez was working through his pre-show checklist when he noticed the same email in his folder, flagged from Crockett's office. He clicked, scrolled, sat up straighter. By 8:20 a.m., he'd forwarded it to his senior producer with one line: "You'll want to read this before 9. And so the shift began. There was no red banner, no headline, just a slow, undeniable pull. One email, one forward, one voice at a time. Jasmine's proposal didn't scream. It didn't posture. It walked people through reality. It whispered facts. It laid out flaws in the housing assistance system that no one had fully mapped before. Not because they weren't there, but because no one had bothered to connect the dots. Until now. By 8:47 a.m., policy analysts at a DC think tank were dissecting Section 4.3 and calling it the most structurally sound voucher reform draft we've seen in a decade. By 9:12 a.m., even a mid-level staffer at a conservative advocacy group posted anonymously on a forum, "Not gonna lie, this thing, kinda brilliant." Karoline's team still hadn't noticed. They were prepping for another interview, rerunning last night's debate clips, planning their next round of media hits. They were still living in the performance. But behind the scenes, the current was changing. Not with volume, but with velocity. Jasmine's silence the night before hadn't been passivity. It had been placement. She hadn't shown her hand on stage because she was laying down the table beneath it. And before noon, that table would be too big for anyone to ignore. By 9:30 a.m., the proposal was no longer just a document. It was a signal. Not the kind broadcast through headlines or breaking news alerts, but something quieter and heavier. The kind that moved beneath the surface and shifted how people spoke in private rooms. A housing policy advisor at the Department of Urban Development had printed the first 10 pages and laid them across her desk, red pen in hand, but 10 minutes later, the pen lay forgotten. The margins remained untouched, because for once the words didn't need fixing, they needed forwarding. By 9:47 a.m., a segment producer at MSNBC sent a Slack message to her booker. "Do we have anyone from Crockett's team lined up? Might want to reconsider." Over at Vox, two editors were on a call, skimming through the proposal in real time, pausing every few paragraphs to say things like, "Did you know this gap even existed?" And "How has no one published this already?" At NPR, a producer flagged the draft for their afternoon segment, describing it as legislation that reads like lived experience, not party politics. What had begun as an email, quietly sent before sunrise, was now being described in conference rooms as a model. The quietness of its release, no rollout, no soundbite, no dramatic confrontation, only amplified its credibility. It was the opposite of what people had come to expect from Washington, and that contrast made it ring louder. Jasmine's proposal wasn't selling a campaign, it was solving a problem. And it did so with such clarity, such unnerving restraint, that even her critics found themselves disarmed. By 10:13 a.m., a conservative think tank staffer in Arlington had annotated Section 7.1 and forwarded it internally with the comment, "This actually addresses implementation delays we've been talking about for years." By 10:32, a lead writer at Politico had paused another piece mid-sentence and opened a blank document with the headline, "Crockett's Housing Bill Turns Quiet Strategy into Legislative Shockwave." There was no official press release from Jasmine's team that morning beyond what had been quietly sent. No press tour, no media blitz. When a reporter from the Hill called for comment, her communications director simply replied, "The document speaks for itself." And it did. Because for every person who expected Jasmine to respond with fire and fury on live television, what she gave them instead was something far more difficult to deny: evidence. There were no theatrics, just page after page of budget analysis, demographic impact projections, state-to-state comparisons, and personal testimony that bled through the numbers. A line from page 14 began circulating among policy wonks on Twitter. The cruelty isn't always in denial. It's in delay, in paperwork, in silence from offices that promise to call back but never do. By 11 a.m., it was clear. This wasn't a ripple. It was a slow-moving avalanche, and it was headed straight for the narrative that Karoline had built overnight. Jasmine hadn't spoken since the night before, but she didn't have to, because her proposal was doing the talking. And every person who read it realized the same thing by the third or fourth page. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about a clapback. This was a challenge, unspoken, undeniable, to every politician still clinging to performance as proof of leadership. And it was gaining ground, quietly, one reader at a time. Karoline sat in her Capitol Hill office, legs crossed, a second latte in hand, as her team crowded around a flat screen, replaying the clip from last night. Again. "Watch her face here," one aide said, pausing on Jasmine's soft smile. "She knows she's cornered." Karoline smirked. "Exactly. That's the look of someone running on fumes." The room laughed, too loud for the hour, too convinced the moment was still theirs. But even as the laughter echoed, Seth, her communications director, stood a little apart, thumbing through his phone, reading something silently. He wasn't smiling. He had seen the email, twice, first as a forward from a contact at Politico, Then again from a producer at CNN who'd simply written, "Thought you'd want to see this before your next segment." It was Jasmine's proposal. No commentary, no attack. Just the bill, and a ripple of attention that was clearly no longer containable. Seth looked up from his screen. "You read this yet?" he asked. Karoline waved him off. "The thing Crockett dropped?" Fluff and footnotes. "We've got the momentum. We don't need to validate her homework." But Seth didn't move. He held up the phone, showing the forwarded summary now making its rounds on Hill group chats. "It's not fluff, and it's not just being read. People are quoting it. People who normally wouldn't even open her emails." Karoline frowned, slowly setting her latte down. "What are you saying?" Seth inhaled carefully. "I'm saying people think it's solid. Some are calling it brilliant. They're connecting dots. You took the stage last night, but she's owning the morning." A long pause settled over the room. One of the junior staffers tried to lighten the tension. So what? We pivot, go harder in interviews, drown her out." Karoline straightened in her chair. "Exactly. We keep hitting." She went quiet because she had no defense. But Seth's phone buzzed again. He glanced down, read quickly inside. "You might want to hold off on calling it quiet. Reuters just published a breakdown, line by line. They say the math checks out. Entirely." Karoline blinked. "That's impossible." "It's not," he said, "because it's real. She's been working on this since before last session ended. This wasn't a reaction. It was strategy." Karoline stood slowly, the confident air thinning around her. She looked at the screen still paused on Jasmine's composed face, now strangely unreadable. Last night she'd thought Jasmine's silence was an empty space for her to fill. This morning it felt like a door she'd walked through without realizing it locked behind her. Outside, the morning press was already changing tone. Not loud, not brutal. Just shifting, subtly but unmistakably. And for the first time since the cameras cut to black, Karoline realized something she hadn't considered. Maybe Jasmine hadn't stayed quiet because she had nothing to say. Maybe she stayed quiet because she knew exactly what was coming next. The shelter sat on the edge of Woonsocket, tucked behind an old red brick post office that hadn't delivered a package on time in years. It wasn't much, just 4 rooms, 2 staffers, and a rotation of volunteers who knew the faces before they knew the names. But it was consistent. And for Jasmine Crockett, consistency mattered more than cameras. She had visited this place before, long before anyone bothered to notice, back when the pipes in the basement froze, and the intake forms were still handwritten in triplicate. So when she walked through the front door that morning, no blazer, no entourage, no announcement. No one clapped. They just made room for her to move. A young staffer handed her a clipboard without even looking up. "New walk-ins," he said. "Mostly referrals. 1 family from Pawtucket, 2 vets, and an intake flagged for disability assistance." Jasmine nodded, took the clipboard, and slipped into the rhythm like it was muscle memory. She knelt beside a mother holding a squirming toddler, not to campaign, not to explain, but to listen. The child clutched a stuffed dog missing 1 ear. Jasmine smiled softly and asked, "When was the last time you slept through the night?" The mother blinked, surprised at the question, then answered, "About a year ago." Jasmine just nodded. No advice, no grand solutions, just presence. The building buzzed with quiet motion. A volunteer filled paper cups with juice. Another checked on the last 2 beds in the back hall. Outside, reporters had begun to gather by the parking lot, tipped off by someone who noticed Jasmine's car. They whispered among themselves, hoping she'd make a statement, or better yet, slip. But she didn't break stride, because this wasn't strategy. This was her schedule. Inside, she moved from person to person, occasionally jotting something on the clipboard, occasionally just listening. At one point, a man named Harris, a bus driver from Providence laid off 6 months ago, looked at her like someone who'd been staring through plexiglass his whole life and finally saw an open window. "I read the thing you put out," he said, voice rough but respectful. "That part about processing delays? That's my life. Been on the list for 8 months. 8. My daughter's staying with my cousin, and I'm couch hopping just to show up at job interviews with a clean shirt." Jasmine placed a hand gently on the table between them. Not reaching, just grounding the moment. It's in the bill because of people like you, she said. People who keep doing the right thing and get punished anyway. The door opened again. A reporter called out, "Congresswoman, is this visit part of a media push for your new proposal?" Jasmine didn't turn. She didn't even pause. She kept moving, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused on a woman trying to decipher a benefits form in broken English. Without looking back, she answered, clear, calm. "I've been coming here for 3 years. They just finally noticed." No soundbite could capture the weight of that sentence. But the room heard it. So did the camera phones, recording from outside through fog glass. What Jasmine had built wasn't just a document. It was a map drawn from shelters like this one, from people whose names would never trend. And now that the world had the map, it was finally starting to ask, who made this? And why hadn't anyone made it sooner? By noon, the headlines had changed. Not all at once, not loudly, but enough. MSNBC Live ran a small chyron during a mid-morning policy segment. Missed swing, Crockett's Bill Gaines traction, after viral debate silence. Over at Vox, a full-length article began trending. How to Win Without Shouting, Jasmine Crockett and the Politics of Restraint. And then NPR followed with a radio segment titled simply, Substance Over Style, What Crockett's Proposal Gets Right. It wasn't a media storm. It was something more dangerous, a realignment. Quiet, steady, inevitable. Inside Karoline Leavitt's office, the mood had shifted from celebration to confusion. The previous night's smirks now felt brittle. Her team sat in a semicircle, reviewing clips from the shelter visit, trying to find something to spin. "She's just doing this for press," one aide said. "It's clearly strategic." But no one replied, because deep down they all knew it wasn't. Jasmine hadn't summoned the media. She'd been found. The cameras had arrived late to a story that had already been written, and now they were just catching up. And then it happened. A link was dropped into the staff group chat without comment. It was a 47-second audio recording. No watermark, no context. Just Karoline's voice, unmistakable, laughing at a private fundraiser in Charleston, South Carolina, 2 weeks earlier. You think they actually read these policies? Please. These people don't care about substance. They care about who makes them feel seen. Give them a slogan and a punchline. They eat it up. I mean, these are folks who can't even fill out basic forms without help. And now we're pretending they understand Crockett's 10-point housing reform? Come on. The room fell silent. Phones buzzed. Aide faces froze. One staffer turned to look at Karoline, her eyes wide. This is real. Within 30 minutes, the clip had over 1.3 million views. By the end of the hour, it crossed 3 million. Karoline's team scrambled for messaging. "Taken out of context," her press secretary tweeted. "Leaked without consent. Political sabotage." But it was too late. The words had landed, and they didn't need context to sting. On CNN, an anchor didn't mince words. That's not a strategy. That's contempt. Conservative radio hosts in key swing districts picked up the story. A few longtime donors pulled back scheduled events. Endorsement conversations were suddenly paused. The echo chamber that had once protected her was now echoing something else. Disbelief. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing. Her team released no statement. The only thing public was a line she delivered at a community housing summit in Des Moines that same afternoon, while the internet exploded behind her. "I'd rather spend my time fixing problems than commenting on someone else's mistakes." That sentence, simple and sharp, was picked up by The Guardian, then the Associated Press, then USA Today. Even people who hadn't followed the story stopped scrolling when they saw it, because it said everything without naming anyone. And in doing so, it named exactly who it needed to. In private strategy rooms, political operatives leaned over maps, worried about the ripple effects. In Leavitt's office, her team now spoke in half sentences, their energy clipped. And in homes across the country, constituents who had never sent a letter to Congress began to type. Not with outrage, but with one question: have you read Jasmine Crockett's proposal? The eyes of the nation were shifting. And Karoline, once the loudest voice in the room, was beginning to realize she was no longer the one being heard. By the time the weekend rolled around, something subtle had settled over the conversation. Not a roar, but a collective shift in tone, as if the country had taken a breath and realized it had been applauding the wrong things. Talk show hosts, previously eager to recap Caroline's best jabs, began to hesitate mid-sentence. Even the late-night comedians, usually quick to jump on any televised stumble, pivoted. The punchlines weren't landing the way they used to, not because the jokes had changed, but because the room had. America wasn't just watching anymore, it was paying attention. Jasmine Crockett hadn't released a follow-up statement. She hadn't tweeted a single thing. In fact, she'd turned down 3 Sunday morning interviews and 2 primetime panel invites. Her team issued only one line, placed quietly in the press inboxes of major outlets. "We welcome all critiques as long as they come with real alternatives. This isn't about who talks louder, it's about who does the work." That quote alone rippled across digital spaces with more force than most televised arguments ever could. Even conservative strategist Dana Haynes retweeted it with a 4-word caption. Hard to argue with that. No fanfare. No viral clip. Just a truth that couldn't be spun. Karoline, meanwhile, was slipping. On Friday, her office released a carefully worded statement claiming her leaked remarks were distorted by political enemies. But no one was buying it. On Saturday, her radio interview aired in full, and when asked directly if she had read Jasmine's proposal, she hesitated for 3 full seconds before saying, "We are reviewing all proposals thoroughly." That pause, small as it was, became the lead gif of the day. Not because it was damning, but because it was empty. And people were done with empty. Constituents who had never written emails before began reaching out, not screaming, not attacking, just asking, "What's your counterplan?" Some shared their own stories. Some asked for links to Jasmine's bill. Others simply said, "We'd like to hear more about the real numbers." And that, more than any leak, any viral line, any media clip, is what broke the old rhythm. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were thinking, questioning, listening. At a local shelter in Akron, Jasmine helped sort donated toiletries into plastic bins. No cameras, no press. Just the usual volunteers and the hum of quiet purpose. A retired school nurse walked up to her, placed a hand on hers and said, "You don't know what this means to us." Jasmine looked at her, really looked, and replied, "I think I do, but I still want to hear you say it." They sat down and talked for 5 minutes. No rush, no handlers, just 2 women, one who had fought her whole life to get noticed, and one finally making sure she was. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't televised. But that moment, unfiltered, unplanned, completely human, was the proof of everything Jasmine had tried to build. And now, finally, the country was learning how to hear it. The carpet in room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was the color of muted charcoal, designed not to distract, not to impress, but to absorb noise and accountability. The long oak table stretched across the center of the chamber, scarred faintly from decades of elbows, folders, and forgotten votes. The nameplates had been freshly printed, the microphones tested, the binders aligned like stage props. But despite the predictable setup, something felt different this morning. The room was full, not full in the usual way, with bored aides scrolling their phones, half listening to another round of procedural tap dancing. No, today the chairs were filled with intention. Members from both sides of the aisle sat straighter than usual. A few even brought notepads, real ones. Word had traveled fast. Jasmine Crockett's bill wasn't just being heard today, it was being watched. Jasmine entered without ceremony, wearing a navy blue suit, low heels, and an expression as unreadable as stone. She carried no entourage, no camera crew, no printed signs for effect. Just one thick binder, clutched in her left hand, the same way she'd carried it through shelters and libraries and municipal gymnasiums. She didn't speak to the press waiting outside the chamber doors. She didn't need to. Her work had already walked ahead of her. As she took her seat, a Republican from Texas looked up briefly, made eye contact, then looked away. 2 seats down, a progressive Democrat whispered to her staffer, Pay attention. She doesn't waste time. The chairperson gavelled the session into order, and with that, the hearing began. The opening speaker from the Housing Subcommittee launched into a routine summary of the morning's agenda, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could feel the center of gravity in the room had shifted, and it wasn't toward him. When it came time for Jasmine to speak, there was no sudden hush, no dramatic pause, just the sound of her microphone turning on and a breath drawn in, calm and measured. In my district, she began, I've met veterans who served this country for 20 years and came home to eviction notices. I've met single mothers working 2 jobs, still disqualified from assistance because a software update didn't process in time. This bill is not perfect, but it is a start. And if we don't have the moral clarity to admit we need a start, then I invite anyone in this room to look those families in the eye and tell them nothing can be done. No shouting, no performance, just stillness wrapped in steel. She continued, walking the committee through the heart of the proposal. Voucher acceleration models, state-level backlog analytics, proposed funding reallocations, accountability timelines for local authorities, and above all, real-life data, not theory, not buzzwords, names, ages, dates. The pages of the binder lay open like a case file, each fact stacked atop the next until denial began to buckle under the weight. The room stayed quiet, not politely but purposefully. There were no rebuttals mid-sentence, no grandstanding, no interruption. Even those who opposed the bill didn't dare talk over her. Not today. And when she finished, Jasmine didn't smile. She simply closed her binder, turned off her mic, and leaned back. She had done what she came to do. Now it was the room's turn to respond. The silence following Jasmine's closing words wasn't awkward. It was sacred. It wasn't the kind of pause that demanded someone fill it. It was the kind that asked everyone to sit with what they just heard. The chairperson cleared his throat, but even he waited an extra beat before continuing. Procedural language resumed, but the cadence of the room had changed. No longer was it moving through bullet points and time limits. Now it was moving through the weight of acknowledgement. Representative Alan Drake from Oregon shifted in his seat. A moderate with a reputation for keeping his head down, Drake rarely engaged in emotional rhetoric. He preferred spreadsheets, compromise, and staying off Twitter. But something in Jasmine's delivery, something in the quiet certainty of her words and the way she never once raised her voice, had landed deeper than expected. He leaned toward his mic and pressed the button, his voice cutting through the stillness. I read the whole proposal, he began, every page. I'll admit I didn't expect to be moved, but I was, not because of any political stunt or media push, but because it's real. It reflects the stories I've heard in my own district, the calls we screen, the letters we pretend to answer. He looked down briefly, then back up. We've gotten used to separating people from paperwork. This bill doesn't let us do that anymore. A few heads nodded. Some remained still, but now with their eyes focused, not drifting. Drake continued, I'm not saying I agree with every point. I'm saying this is serious, and serious deserves to be heard, fully. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't shift or smile. She simply looked at him, eyes steady as if to say, thank you for arriving. However late, you're here. More lawmakers weighed in, some cautiously, others with the relief of having permission to care out loud. A representative from Colorado mentioned the overwhelming number of housing backlog complaints his office had fielded in just the past quarter. A junior member from Florida, previously skeptical, admitted the data surprised her. I thought this was just another symbolic document, she said quietly, but the numbers, they don't flinch, and I guess neither does the author. Throughout the exchange, Jasmine remained still, her binder closed, her pen untouched. Her presence in the room had shifted from participant to reference point. She no longer needed to argue. She had built the argument days, weeks, and months before she ever entered the room, and now it was unfolding on its own. Outside the chamber, staffers watching through the glass exchanged looks, some astonished, others uncertain. One whispered, "This thing might actually get legs." Another responded, "Not might. It already has." Meanwhile, in the public viewing section, A reporter from the Washington Post furiously typed notes while simultaneously sending texts to her editor. She didn't expect fireworks today, but she knew enough to recognize momentum, especially when it moved without noise. When the hearing adjourned for a short recess, the room didn't scatter like it usually did. Members lingered. They talked quietly among themselves. Not about scheduling, not about spin, but about amendments, logistics, and questions worth asking. And through it all, Jasmine sat in the same position she had started, composed, unreadable, unshaken. The work had spoken, and now, finally, the hearts in the room were starting to listen. Outside the Rayburn building, the usual churn of passing tourists, staffers, and journalists had slowed into something more focused. There were no chants, no bullhorns, no cardboard signs with bold red letters screaming for justice. Instead, there were folding chairs, thermoses, elderly couples in lawn hats, teenagers in school uniforms with clipboards, veterans in faded caps sitting shoulder to shoulder with mothers balancing toddlers on their knees. It wasn't a protest, it was presence. Someone had started handing out stickers that read, "Policy over performance." Another wore a shirt that simply said, "Let the work speak." No one claimed to organize the gathering. It just happened. Word of Jasmine's hearing spread quickly that morning, and by the time the vote was called for recess, the courtyard outside had quietly filled. Not with outrage, but with a kind of solemn patience the city hadn't seen in a long time. They weren't waiting for a confrontation. They were waiting to see if something, finally, would be taken seriously. A woman in a wheelchair held a handwritten sign on her lap. "I sent 5 letters." Jasmine was the only one who answered. Next to her, a teenage boy offered water bottles from a red cooler, his voice soft, almost reverent. "No charge. She listens. We show up." When Jasmine emerged from the building, she didn't wave. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't need to. The crowd saw her, and she saw them, not as an audience, but as the very people whose stories sat inside her binder, whose sentences shaped her legislation, whose delays and denials had filled the margins of her draft with real-world urgency. She didn't make a speech. She walked into the crowd as if she'd always meant to be there. People stood. Some clapped gently. A few just placed their hands over their hearts. One woman in her 60s reached out and touched Jasmine's sleeve, eyes shining with something between exhaustion and faith. "You're the first one who didn't make me feel like a number," she whispered. Jasmine leaned in, held the woman's gaze, and responded just loud enough for her to hear. "You never were." A camera caught the moment, not framed, not planned, just real, and within hours the photo was everywhere. Not because it was performative, but because it wasn't. It wasn't posed or press briefed or choreographed. It was just 2 women, one who had been waiting too long to matter, and another who never forgot why she came. And in that stillness, something crystallized. This wasn't just about a bill. It was about being seen. And for the first time in a long time, the crowd outside Congress wasn't there to demand their worth. They were there because someone had already given it back. While cable news loops replayed her words and op-eds dissected her tone, Jasmine Crockett sat in a quiet conference room 3 floors above the noise. The windows overlooked a sliver of the Capitol dome, but she wasn't paying attention to the view. Her laptop was open, her calendar empty for the next 3 hours by choice, and the door closed not out of secrecy, but out of discipline. There were requests piling up, panel invitations, podcast interviews, primetime exclusives, all asking the same thing in different ways. Would she respond now? But Jasmine wasn't here to respond. She was here to keep working. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, was everywhere, on morning shows, conservative radio, live streaming from campaign stops with a new line about bureaucratic overreach dressed in soft tones. She called Jasmine's bill policy theater with emotional music, even as her own party's internal memos warned her to soften the attacks. But Karoline didn't back down. She doubled down. Her voice rose. Her smile grew sharper. And with every appearance, she thought she was holding her ground. But something kept slipping. In interview after interview, hosts asked not just what she opposed, but why she hadn't proposed something better. "What would your plan look like?" one host asked. "How would you address the wait lists, the disbursement delays, the 1 in 4 rejection rate for qualified applicants?" Karoline deflected. talked about personal responsibility, fiscal discipline, the importance of local governance. But the anchor pressed again. So, you haven't read her proposal? The pause was half a second too long. We're reviewing all materials submitted by the minority. And just like that, another clip spread, not of a win, not of a blow, but of a non-answer that echoed louder than any shout. Jasmine's silence was never passive. It was calculated restraint. She wasn't avoiding the fight. She was choosing a different ring, one where policy outweighed punchlines, one where outcomes mattered more than optics. While Karoline volleyed through talking points, Jasmine's team quietly released a technical brief, 50 pages of proposed adjustments based on bipartisan feedback, state-by-state budget reallocations, and public-private housing partnerships. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't tweeted, but by noon, 3 Senate offices had requested private briefings. In the war of attention, Jasmine was winning a different battle, the one not waged on screens, but in rooms that actually voted. Leanna entered the room with a stack of mail, dropping it gently beside Jasmine's laptop. You've got 43 letters from community leaders. Most of them just say thank you. Jasmine looked up, a small smile breaking through for the first time that day. They're not asking for more? Nope, Leanna replied. They're saying this is the first time someone actually put their story into federal language. Jasmine closed her laptop, rested her hands over the top, and exhaled. Good. Then we're not done, but we're right. She stood, stretching her shoulders, and walked to the window. Not for inspiration, but for reflection. The world outside still spun, still screamed. But inside this room, the silence felt earned. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't snapped back. She hadn't walked onto the media battlefield armed with insults and bravado. And yet somehow, without shouting, Jasmine Crockett was winning. That Sunday morning, political talk shows buzzed with clips of Karoline's latest media run. Her message had grown sharper, more agitated. She accused Jasmine of emotional manipulation, of weaponizing stories to distract from flawed policy. The words were delivered with conviction, the camera framed tight on her face. It was on paper a strong performance. But something felt off. The tempo was right, the structure was right, and yet the weight was missing. Over at Morning Joe, a segment aired that hadn't been planned 2 days prior. A political strategist, one who had helped shape Karoline's media rollout in previous election cycles, was asked a direct question. What do you make of Jasmine Crockett's silence? The strategist hesitated, just long enough to signal that his answer would depart from the script. Honestly, he said, it's devastating, not because it's weak, but because it's surgical. Jasmine didn't argue on stage. She didn't attack. She let the work speak. And the work is airtight. The hosts blinked. That wasn't the soundbite they expected, but it was the one viewers leaned into. Backstage at the studio, a producer shook her head as she reviewed incoming messages. We're not used to that in politics, she murmured. Restraint? With results? It didn't compute, not in the usual metrics of outrage and virality, but it was resonating. Jasmine, meanwhile, was in a modest community center in Dayton, Ohio, sitting in a folding chair between a high school principal and a retired sanitation worker. No reporters, no stage, no live stream. Just 30 people with notebooks, questions, and stories. She had arrived an hour earlier than scheduled, greeting people one by one as they filtered in, shaking hands, asking names, remembering them. When she spoke, it wasn't from a podium. It was from eye level. What we've built isn't a miracle, she told the room. It's not a rescue, it's a repair. And repairs take listening, not headlines. A young woman in the back raised her hand. What made you decide not to fight back during the debate? Jasmine smiled, not defensively, but gently, because sometimes fighting back means showing them what they're not ready for. And what they weren't ready for was a solution. Back in Washington, Karoline's team gathered for another strategy session, reviewing polling numbers that had plateaued. Social engagement had slowed. Donor enthusiasm was cooling. And worst of all, the media wasn't chasing them anymore. It was chasing the policy. One staffer spoke up, hesitant. We could pivot to education reform, or maybe double down on the fiscal angle. Caroline shook her head, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. No, she snapped. We don't pivot. We push back. She ambushed us with that bill. We're not just letting it play unchallenged. Seth, her communications director, looked away and sighed. In another chat window, he typed a quiet message to a friend on the Hill. She's spiraling, won't let it go. It's getting obvious. But while Caroline chased cameras, Jasmine kept walking through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, reading proposals in church basements, updating her bill draft based on feedback from people no one usually asked. She didn't post selfies. She didn't grandstand. But she was building something far more durable than visibility. And in homes across the country, people started saying things they hadn't said in years. Maybe this one's actually different. Because real leadership doesn't perform. It builds, quietly, steadily, until the noise fades and the foundation remains. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Jasmine Crockett stepped into the community room at St. Mark's in Akron, Ohio. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old linoleum. Nothing glamorous, nothing staged. The chairs were metal, the kind that creaked when you shifted. A fold-out table near the entrance offered coffee and foam cups and a tray of slightly stale donuts. On the wall, a handmade banner read, "Community Voices Matter," painted crooked but sincere. There were no TV trucks outside, no podium at the front, no rows of press credentials dangling from lanyards. Just people, some leaning forward, some folding their arms, skeptical, some holding printouts of Jasmine's bill in plastic sleeves. A few looked tired, not just from the hour, but from decades of feeling unheard. Jasmine didn't start with a speech. She walked the rows, shook hands, asked names. When she finally did speak, her voice was calm, grounded. "I'm not here to sell you anything," she said. "I'm here because policy means nothing if it doesn't touch your life. And I don't want to pass something that only looks good on a website. I want to pass something that looks good in your mailbox, on the day your rent drops or your voucher arrives on time, or your kid sleeps in the same bed 2 months in a row." Silence met her, not out of doubt, but out of the rarest thing in politics, trust being born. A single father in the third row raised his hand. "What if it doesn't pass? What if they tear it up and send it back to you shredded?" Jasmine met his eyes. "Then I put it back together," she said, "with your help, again and again, until they either pass it or explain on record why they won't." That landed. A grandmother stood next. "Why don't more of them come here to rooms like this?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "Because these rooms don't clap the way TV studios do." But they remember. People began to nod. The town hall stretched past its scheduled end. No one left. They leaned in, asked questions, shared stories, some angry, some heartbreaking, all true. Jasmine didn't deflect. She didn't promise what she couldn't deliver. She just listened, answered, and took notes. And when it was over, there was no standing ovation, no campaign anthem played through speakers, just quiet clapping, the kind that means something because it isn't expected. As people filed out, a woman approached, holding a folder against her chest like it was sacred. "This," she said, handing it to Jasmine, "is what no one wanted to read last year. I think maybe you will." Jasmine took it gently, nodded once, and replied, "You've already been heard. Now let's make sure you're seen." No headlines would cover this night. No tweet would trend. But in a room without cameras, something real had just begun. The chamber wasn't loud. It rarely was during votes. The hum of whispered conversations, the shuffle of documents, and the soft clicks of the electronic tally system made up the ambient soundtrack of another legislative afternoon. But something felt different. Not because the room was full, though it was. Not because the media waited anxiously in the hallway, though they did. It was different because this time, what was being voted on didn't feel like another bill. It felt like a question about whether stories counted, about whether silence could lead, about whether a woman who refused to perform had managed, through sheer clarity and persistence, to move a room built to resist change. Jasmine Crockett sat 2 rows back from the podium, her binder closed on the table in front of her. She wasn't watching the screen. She wasn't counting the names. She just waited. One by one, the votes rolled in. The chairperson read each name slowly, deliberately, giving weight to the moment. Representative Abbott? Yes. Representative Bowman? No. Representative Drake? A pause, then steady. Yes. That one earned a glance across the room. Drake hadn't co-sponsored, hadn't committed, but today he crossed the threshold and everyone noticed. Jasmine didn't react. More votes followed. A handful of moderate Republicans joined. An independent from Arizona who rarely broke ranks quietly whispered yes into the mic. The numbers ticked upward. 210, then 217, then the final unwavering moment. 229 in favor, 204 against. The chamber fell still, not erupting, not roaring, just still. Because every person in that room understood they had just witnessed something rare. A bill carried not by popularity or party pressure, but by something older, something harder. It had been carried by work, by weight, by someone who refused to treat policy like theater and instead treated it like a mirror, held up until others could no longer look away. Jasmine exhaled softly. She didn't smile. She didn't raise a fist. She didn't turn to the cameras lining the rear wall. She simply whispered to herself, "Good." And in that moment, the room didn't cheer. Not because they didn't care, but because they did. What had passed wasn't just legislation. It was a shift, a permission, a proof of concept that in a city addicted to noise, sometimes a calm voice and a solid draft could carry further than the loudest punchline. Outside, the vote was announced by reporters as breaking news. But inside the room, no one moved quickly. They lingered, not out of confusion, but out of reverence for what had just taken place. Jasmine gathered her things slowly, deliberately, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood what had just been confirmed. This wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a new way to win one. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the chamber, the news had already broken. Cable tickers rolled the numbers. Social media splintered into reactions. Some praised, some questioned, some, as always, spun. But the message was clear. The bill had passed its first and most critical barrier, and not just passed. It had drawn unexpected allies, reshaped old lines, and done what few thought possible in this climate. It had pulled the conversation back to substance. Outside, a reporter shouted her name. Another raised a mic. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you feel vindicated?" Jasmine didn't slow her pace. She simply responded, eyes ahead, voice even. "I feel aligned." That word stuck. Aligned with her work, with the people it was built for, with a movement that hadn't needed a slogan to find its legs. As she descended the stone steps of the Capitol, the buzz followed her, not from the press, but from texts lighting up her phone. Mayors, teachers, clergy. A bus driver in Chicago who wrote, "I watched them say yes to us." Back in Leavitt's office, the mood had curdled. She sat in front of a glowing screen as the vote tally replayed on loop. Her staff spoke in low voices, as if too much sound might cause further unraveling. The phrase, "you've been outflanked by silence," had already appeared in 3 headlines. Donors weren't calling, they were waiting, which in politics was worse. She turned to Seth. "We can pivot, hit immigration, push jobs, we reframe." But Seth didn't respond right away. His phone buzzed again. Another message, another notification. Finally, he looked up and said, "We don't need a new frame, Karoline. We need a mirror." Across the country, something quieter stirred. In church halls and civic centers, in living rooms and bus stops, people were talking, softly but clearly, about what it meant to see someone walk into the storm and never once raise her voice, about what it meant to be represented not in theory, but in follow-through. In Kansas City, a teacher printed Jasmine's final remarks and taped them to her classroom door. In Atlanta, a mother showed her daughter the vote results like they were a victory parade. And in a small town in Montana, a retired veteran wrote to his local paper, "She never promised to fix everything. She just showed me she knew I existed. And that's a start I've been waiting for." Jasmine wasn't watching the coverage. She was back in her office, finally removing her heels and sitting on the edge of the couch. Her team sat in silence, waiting for her to speak. She looked around the room, at people who had walked with her from shelter basements to committee hearings, and said, "They moved. Not because we shouted, but because we stayed." It was never about a single vote. It was about changing the rhythm, and now the country was moving to hers. The hallway outside the chamber was nearly empty by dusk. Most had packed up, eager to get to dinner, flights, or interviews. The spotlight had shifted elsewhere, as it always did, but Jasmine Crockett remained, her steps slow, purposeful, echoing gently against the marble floors as she moved down the corridor with the same calm she'd carried through the entire fight. There was no camera following her, no aide trailing behind with notes, just the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of her heels against stone. At the far end of the hallway, a janitor, gray hoodie under his work vest, earbuds tucked into one ear, looked up from his mop bucket. He paused when he saw her. "You're her," he said, not in awe but in recognition. Jasmine smiled faintly. "Only on Tuesdays," she replied, the joke soft. He chuckled and nodded toward the chamber behind her. "Did it go through?" She didn't give the speech she'd given in committee, didn't rattle off the numbers. She just said, "Yes." The man leaned on his mop handle for a moment, thoughtful. "Good," he said. "Some of us were waiting a long time to hear that." Jasmine nodded once, a quiet confirmation. She wasn't in a hurry to leave, not because she needed the moment, but because she understood the weight of letting it land. She had spent weeks walking into rooms where she wasn't expected to lead, into spaces where silence was mistaken for submission, and into debates where volume was mistaken for power. But she had said what needed to be said, without raising her voice, without branding her pain, and without letting anyone else define the terms of her presence. She walked toward the exit, the doors tall and golden and heavy. Just before she reached them, a young female staffer from another office called out, "Congresswoman Crockett!" Jasmine turned, expectant but relaxed. The staffer hesitated, eyes wide like she was surprised by her own courage. "Do you feel like you finally got the last word?" Jasmine took a breath, then let the silence stretch just long enough to make the answer matter. She stepped a little closer, dropped her voice just enough to pull the room inward, and replied, "There was never supposed to be a last word, just better ones." And with that, she turned, pushed the door open, and stepped into the twilight. Outside, the air was cool, the city pulsing quietly beneath a sky turning from steel gray to indigo. She didn't wave. She didn't look back. The vote was done. The story was written. And the road ahead, still long, still hard, felt a little more certain now. Because some leaders win applause, but the ones who last, they win without a mic. Real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet commitment to do what's right, without needing applause, recognition, or a camera. Jasmine Crockett reminded us that true leadership isn't about dominating a room. It's about elevating the voices no one hears. In your own life, the greatest impact may come not from what you say, but from what you consistently do. So ask yourself, where in your world can you stop performing and start showing up with quiet purpose? Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones never spoken. Jasmine Crockett didn't clap back. She didn't shout. She just worked, while the world was too busy watching the wrong noise. And when the moment came, she let her silence carry the truth. Not to win the room, but to win something bigger: respect, policy, and real change. So now it's your turn. If you believe that doing the work still matters, if you believe that the quiet ones still shape history, then don't just watch. Be part of this movement. Hit that subscribe button. Share this story with someone who still thinks silence is weakness. Because here at Leo's Stories, we don't tell fairy tales. We tell the fight for truth.